Good evening, Seekers. Welcome back to the Book of Ancient Worlds. In the first chapter, we stood at the doorway of civilization and asked how the long human story began to gather itself into villages, memory, and stone. In the second chapter, we followed the rivers and saw how water gave the first cities their shape. Tonight, we turn toward Egypt, but not only the Egypt of golden masks and finished pyramids. We begin farther back, in the quieter shadows before the dream became famous. Before Egypt became a kingdom, it was a landscape of patient forces. The desert watched from either side. The Nile moved through the middle like a dark thread of life. Along its banks, people learned the mood of the water and the weight of the seasons. They did not yet live inside the world we picture when we hear the word Egypt. There were no great pharaohs ruling from carved halls. There were no vast stone pyramids rising above the horizon. There was only the river, the sky, the dead, the living, and the slow discovery that this narrow green world could hold a civilization unlike any other. It is easy to imagine ancient Egypt as if it appeared all at once, already complete and shining beneath the sun. But no civilization begins that way. What later seems eternal begins in fragile choices, a grave dug with care, a pot shaped by hand, a village placed near water, a symbol marked because someone wanted a thing to be remembered. These early acts were small, but they carried the first outlines of a much larger dream. Long before Egypt became a name that echoed through temples and tombs, people along the Nile were already learning how to live with permanence in mind. The river taught them slowly. It did not simply give life, it demanded attention. Each year, its rising waters changed the land and refreshed the soil. Each year, people had to remember what had happened before and prepare for what might come again. Over generations, that attention became knowledge. Knowledge became custom. Custom became power. The same river that fed the fields also shaped the imagination, because it showed that life could return after disappearance, and that what seemed lost beneath the water might rise again in a new form. Tonight's chapter is about that beginning. Not the polished Egypt of monuments alone, but the older Egypt beneath it. The Egypt of riverbanks and desert edges, the Egypt of early villages, sacred burials, animal forms, painted vessels, and the first signs of a people beginning to see the world as something ordered, mysterious, and alive with meaning. We are not looking for a single moment when Egypt began. We are listening for the long change in the dark, when scattered communities slowly became a civilization that would one day build for eternity. So settle in now. Let the room grow quiet around you. Let the noise of the present loosen its hold. Ahead of us is the Nile before the Pharaohs, flowing beneath a sky full of old stars, carrying the first dreams of Egypt toward the stone horizon. Section 2. The Nile did not announce itself as the beginning of a kingdom. It moved through the land long before there were crowns, long before anyone carved royal names into stone, long before the dead were sealed beneath monuments meant to defeat time. To the first people who lived near it, the river was not a symbol at first. It was the difference between endurance and disappearance. Beyond the green banks, the desert stretched outward with a silence that could empty the mind. Beside the water, reeds moved in the wind, birds crossed the morning light, and the soil darkened after the flood. The world gave two lessons at once. One part of it could take life away with heat and distance. Another part could return life again with water. This contrast shaped Egypt before Egypt had a name. The people who settled near the Nile did not simply choose a convenient place to live. They entered into a relationship with a landscape that was unusually clear in its boundaries. The river valley was narrow enough to be understood by those who walked it, yet long enough to feel almost endless. The desert pressed close, so the fertile land became precious. Every season made the difference visible. Where the river touched, things could grow. Where it did not, the earth waited in stillness. Over time, that sharp division helped create a way of seeing the world that would remain in Egyptian thought for thousands of years. Order was not an abstract idea, it was the green line of life holding against the surrounding emptiness. In these early centuries, the people of the Nile Valley were still close to older ways of living. Some moved with animals and seasons, some stayed longer near reliable water, some built homes that could be remade when they failed, leaving only faint traces for the distant future to find. But even in those fragile beginnings, the pattern was changing. A settled life asks different questions of the people who live it. It asks where food will come from when the easy season passes. It asks who remembers the height of the last flood. It asks how a child will learn the shape of the land without wandering too far into danger. A camp can dissolve when the season turns, but a village begins to gather memory around itself. That gathering is one of the quiet beginnings of Egypt. Not a sudden invention, but a deepening attachment to place. People began to know certain bends of the river as home. The dead were buried near the living, and this mattered more than it may seem. A burial fixes memory into the ground. It says that a person belonged here, and that those who remain will return to the same place with grief, food, stories, and recognition. Long before the great tombs, long before the painted chambers and carved spells, there was already this older instinct. The body was placed carefully, the earth was closed over it, the living stepped away, but not completely. A bond remained. From such acts, a civilization begins to become inwardly rich. The first Egyptian world was not built only by farming or by the river's annual return. It was also built by the belief that life had layers and that the visible world was not the whole of reality. The sky, the river, the desert, the animals, the dead beneath the sand, the returning flood, and the rising sun all pressed meaning into daily life. The people who would one day become Egyptians did not separate survival from mystery as sharply as we often do. The same river that watered the fields could also suggest rebirth. The same desert that threatened the living could preserve the dead. The same horizon that swallowed the sun each evening could promise its return. This is why early Egypt feels older than its monuments. The pyramids did not create the Egyptian imagination, they rose from it. Before stone learned to speak in royal forms, the people of the Nile had already spent generations learning that the world moved in patterns. Dawn returned, flood returned, growth returned. The dead seemed to depart, yet their presence lingered in memory and ritual. Slowly, those patterns became more than observations. They became a way of trusting that reality had an order beneath its changes. Later, Egyptians would give that order sacred names, but the feeling itself was older than the words. As we move deeper into this chapter, we are not searching for one first city or one first king. We are watching a people learn how permanence might be imagined in a world where everything still changed. The river rose and fell, villages grew and faded, bodies returned to the earth. But memory stayed near the water, meaning gathered along the banks. Out of that gathering came the first faint shape of Egypt, not yet royal and not yet monumental, but already looking toward eternity. Section 3. Long before Egypt became a kingdom of carved names and royal crowns, it was a place of villages learning how to remain. The earliest communities along the Nile did not leave behind the monuments that make the world stop and stare. Their homes were made from materials that could return easily to the earth. Their world was practical. close and vulnerable. Yet beneath that ordinary surface, something lasting was beginning to form. People were learning the rhythm of staying in one place long enough for memory to gather there. A village changes the way human life feels. When people return to the same hearth, the same riverbank, and the same burial ground beyond the edge of settlement, the land begins to hold their story. Children learn the safe paths after the flood. Elders remember how high the water rose in years before. The river becomes more than water. It becomes a presence with moods. The desert becomes more than distance. It becomes the edge of the known world. A people who stay begin to notice more deeply, and what they notice becomes part of who they are. This is where Egypt's later dream of eternity begins to feel less sudden. The great tombs of the pharaohs were not born from nothing. They grew from older habits of care. In the pre-dynastic world, the dead were often placed in the dry desert sand, where the body could be preserved in a way the living could not fully explain, but surely must have noticed. The desert did not only threaten life, it also kept things. What the green valley consumed and renewed, the dry sand held still. To people watching closely, this must have felt powerful. The dead were gone, yet not entirely erased. From that quiet discovery, imagination could travel very far. If the dead could remain in some form, perhaps death was not a simple ending. If the sun disappeared each evening and returned each morning, perhaps departure itself belonged to a larger pattern. If the river withdrew and came back again with fertile darkness in its waters, perhaps loss and return were woven into the world. Early Egypt did not need finished theology to feel these things. Before there were temple walls covered in sacred writing, there were people watching the same mysteries year after year and slowly giving them meaning. The graves of this older Egypt were not yet grand passages into eternity, but they already show a human refusal to let life pass without witness. Objects were placed near the dead because the dead still mattered. Bodies were positioned with intention because the body was not treated as worthless once breath had left it. The living answered death with arrangement, with memory, and with a care that crossed the boundary between what could be seen and what could only be hoped. In that gesture, the first faint outline of the Egyptian afterlife begins to appear. When we imagine the beginning of Egypt, we may be tempted to look for the first king. But before a king could rule Egypt, Egypt had to become imaginable. People had to feel that the valley was connected. They had to share enough symbols, enough fears, enough hopes, and enough ways of honoring the unseen to recognize something larger than one village. The land had to become more than scattered places along a river. It had to become a world. So tonight, as we drift through this older Egypt, we should not rush toward the pyramids. They are waiting far ahead, bright and immense in the distance. For now, the story is quieter. It is a burial in dry sand. It is a settlement near the water. It is a family returning to the same place after the flood has gone down. It is the first sense that the Nile Valley could hold not only survival, but memory. And from memory, slowly, the dream of Egypt begins to rise. Section 4. As the villages of the Nile Valley became more settled, Egypt began to develop a language before writing had fully arrived. It was not yet the language of scribes, carved in neat lines for kings and gods, but a quieter language carried by shape, color, placement, and repetition. A painted vessel, a carved handle, a figure of an animal, or the careful arrangement of a grave could say something about the world without needing to speak. These early signs did not explain themselves to us clearly, but they show that people were already thinking symbolically. They were already turning daily life into meaning. This matters because Egypt would one day become one of the most image-rich civilizations on Earth. Its walls would fill with gods, animals, stars, boats, offerings, and bodies moving through sacred gestures. Its writing would grow from pictures into a system capable of preserving names, prayers, commands, and stories. But the habit of seeing meaning in images was older than the great temples. It began in a world where a pattern painted on clay could do more than decorate a surface. It could reflect a memory, a belief, a hope, or a connection to something larger than ordinary use. In the pre-dynastic period, some pottery was painted with boats moving across pale surfaces, with human figures standing in strange postures, with animals that seem more than merely observed from life. The exact meanings are not always certain, and we should be careful not to pretend we can read every mark as the ancient makers did. Yet, the feeling is unmistakable. These objects belong to a people whose imagination was widening. The river, the desert, the hunt, the dead, the sky, and the unseen powers of the world were all becoming part of a shared symbolic atmosphere. Boats became especially important in the Egyptian mind. At the simplest level, this makes sense. The Nile was the great road of the land, and boats were how people moved through that road with purpose. But in Egypt, practical things often gathered sacred weight over time. A boat could carry grain or people through the valley, yet it could also become an image of passage. It could suggest movement from one place to another, from life toward death, from darkness toward return. Later, the sun itself would be imagined crossing the sky and the underworld in a sacred vessel. That later vision did not appear from nowhere. It had roots in a landscape where water was already the path through life. Animals also carried deep power in the early imagination of Egypt. A falcon in the sky, a bull in the field, a crocodile near the water, a jackal moving along the desert edge, all belonged to the living world around the Nile. But they also seemed to possess qualities that human beings could admire, fear, or place beyond themselves. Strength, watchfulness, danger, speed, fertility, and survival were not abstract ideas when they could be seen in the body of an animal. Over time, such creatures became more than creatures. They became signs of forces that shaped existence. This is one of the most important things to understand about early Egypt. The sacred did not have to arrive from somewhere far away. It was already present in the land. The river was not only water. The desert was not only sand. The horizon was not only a line where the sun disappeared. The animal was not only an animal. The dead were not only gone. The world was full of surfaces that seemed to open into deeper meanings, and the people of the Nile Valley learned to carry those meanings into the things they made. The more these symbols were repeated, the more they could bind communities together. A shared image can travel farther than a single voice. It can appear on pottery, in burial customs, in ritual objects, and in the memory of those who have seen it before. Without a single king commanding the whole valley, ideas could still move along the Nile. The river carried people and goods, but it also carried recognition. A shape made in one place could be understood in another. A sacred form could slowly become familiar across distance. By the time Egypt moved closer to kingship, it already possessed a rich inner world. The future civilization did not have to invent all of its meanings at once. Many were waiting in older habits, older images, and older ways of looking at the land. The great achievement of later Egypt was not only that it built monuments, but that it gave lasting form to symbols that had been gathering strength for generations. The pharaohs would claim the language of eternity, but the first words of that language were whispered earlier in painted clay, desert graves, riverboats, animal forms, and the long attention of people learning to see the sacred in the world around them. Section 5. As the Nile Valley moved closer to becoming a kingdom, Power began to gather in human form. It did not arrive all at once, and it did not begin with the finished image of the pharaoh seated beneath a crown. Before that figure could exist, there had to be chiefs, strong households, trusted leaders, successful warriors, ritual specialists, and families whose authority grew because others depended on them. In a small village, leadership could remain close and personal. In a wider river valley, where settlements touched one another through trade, marriage, rivalry, and ritual, power had to stretch farther. The river made this possible because it connected the land in a way the desert could not. A leader who controlled only one small place could influence the fields and people nearby, but the Nile offered a path for authority to travel. Goods could move along it, and so could messages, symbols, customs, threats, alliances, and claims. The more connected the valley became, the more important it was for people to recognize power beyond their own settlement. A ruler did not need to be everywhere if his signs could travel before him. This is where the early symbols of kingship begin to matter. In later Egypt, power would become deeply formal, wrapped in crowns, names, sacred animals, ritual poses, and images of the ruler striking down chaos. Those images can feel almost timeless, as if they had always belonged to Egypt, but they grew out of older attempts to make authority visible. A leader had to be more than strong in one moment. He had to appear connected to order itself. He had to stand between the living community and the forces that threatened it. Flood, hunger, enemies, death, disorder, and fear all pressed against the edges of life, and the ruler's image promised that someone could hold the center. That promise was powerful, even if reality was never so simple. The early rulers of the Nile Valley were not only managing people, they were shaping belief. Their authority depended on the sense that the world could be organized through them. Over time, the ruler became more than a successful man with followers. He became a sacred figure, a living point where human order and divine order met. The pharaoh of later centuries would inherit this idea in its grandest form, but the roots were older. Before Egypt had pyramids, it was already learning to imagine leadership as something cosmic. The movement toward unity was not gentle. The forming of Egypt likely involved competition and violence as well as exchange and shared belief. Communities did not simply agree one day to become one civilization. Power gathered unevenly. Some places rose above others. Some symbols became dominant while others faded. The story that later Egyptians told about the unification of the two lands was polished by time and royal memory, but behind that polished memory, there must have been struggle. A kingdom is not only a beautiful idea, it is also the result of many smaller worlds being drawn into one larger order. Yet the remarkable thing is that this order became so enduring. The idea of Upper and Lower Egypt, joined together under one ruler, became one of the great foundations of Egyptian identity. The valley and the delta were different landscapes, but the royal imagination bound them into a single sacred whole. The king did not merely govern land, he embodied the joining of lands. His body, his crown, his rituals, and his names helped make Egypt think of itself as one world. By the time kingship fully emerged, Egypt had already gathered many of the elements that would define it for thousands of years. The Nile gave rhythm to the year. The desert gave the dead a place of preservation and mystery. The sky gave patterns of return. Images gave invisible forces a visible form. Villages and graves gave memory a place to root. Kingship gathered these older meanings and placed them beneath the sign of rule. This is why Egypt can feel so sudden in history, even though it was not sudden at all. Once kingship appeared in its recognizable form, it seemed to organize everything around itself. The ruler stood at the center of the land, and around him, the river, the fields, the temples, the dead, and the gods began to form a single vision of order. But that vision had been prepared slowly by generations who lived before the great names. The first kings did not create Egypt from emptiness. They inherited a valley already full of memory, then gave that memory a crown. Section 6. As Egypt moved toward unity, the old river world began to take on a sharper shape. The scattered settlements of earlier centuries did not vanish, but they were drawn into a larger pattern. Power gathered along the Nile as if the river itself were helping pull the valley into one long body. The distance between communities mattered less when boats could move through the heart of the land. A symbol carried downstream could be seen far from the place where it was first made. A ruler's influence could travel with messengers, goods, ceremonies, and fear. Slowly, the idea of Egypt became wider than any single village could hold. Later tradition would remember this change through the joining of Upper and Lower Egypt. The valley in the south and the delta in the north were not the same kind of landscape, yet the Egyptian imagination found a way to bind them together. This joining became more than politics. It became sacred geography. Egypt was not only ruled as one land, it was imagined as one land held together by balance. The river connected what the desert separated, and the king became the living sign that the connection had been made. This is where the figure of the early king begins to feel almost larger than human. He was not yet the distant monument builder of later ages, but his image already carried the weight of order. In early royal art, the ruler appears with a force that is meant to be unmistakable. He stands above enemies, above disorder, above the confusion that threatens the settled world. These images were not simple portraits. They were statements about what rule was supposed to do. A king was expected to defend the fragile pattern of life that had grown along the Nile. He was expected to make the land feel held. One of the most famous objects from this early time is the Nama palette, a ceremonial stone tablet often connected with Egypt's unification. We should be careful with it, because ancient objects rarely mean only one thing, and later history can make them seem clearer than they were. But even with that caution, the palette gives us a powerful glimpse of Egypt becoming itself. The king appears in ritual form, wearing crowns associated with different parts of the land, surrounded by symbols of victory, order, and divine approval. It is not just an image of a man, it is an image of a world being organized around kingship. What matters most is not only whether one king completed the unification in one dramatic act. History is usually less neat than that. What matters is that by this time, Egypt had developed a way to picture power that would last for thousands of years. The ruler was shown as the one who overcame chaos and made unity visible. The land was not merely inhabited, it was ordered. The king did not merely command, he represented the harmony that allowed fields to grow, rituals to continue, graves to be honored, and the seasons to keep their meaning. This idea would become one of Egypt's deepest foundations. Later, pharaohs would inherit a role that had already been shaped by the earliest kings. They would stand between human life and cosmic order. Their ceremonies would renew the world in symbolic form. Their names would be written inside sacred frames. Their tombs would be built as if a ruler's death was not a disappearance, but a passage into another kind of power. All of that grandeur began here, in the early joining of land, symbol, ritual, and rule. The rise of kingship also changed the scale of what people could build. When labor could be gathered across wider regions, projects became larger and more permanent. When authority reached farther, memory could be organized beyond one village or one family. Egypt began to develop the habits that would later make its monuments possible. A great pyramid was still far in the future, but the social imagination needed for such a thing was beginning to form. People were learning to see the work of many hands as part of one sacred order. So the early kingdom was not only a political achievement, it was a change in how the Nile Valley understood itself. The land had become connected enough to be ruled, symbolic enough to be imagined, and ordered enough to endure. Before Egypt built its most famous stones, it built the idea that the world could be held together through kingship, ritual, and the steady return of the river. From that idea, the Egypt we remember would slowly rise. Section 7. Once kingship had given Egypt a center, the question became how that center would last. A ruler could win power in a lifetime, but Egypt was already beginning to think beyond the limits of a single life. The land itself seemed to encourage this way of thinking. The Nile returned after absence. The sun came back after sinking into darkness. The body placed in dry sand could remain in a way that felt almost unnatural. Around every side of ordinary life, the Egyptians saw signs that disappearance did not always mean destruction. Something could pass from sight and still continue. This belief did not become grand all at once. It grew slowly through burial, memory, and ritual care. The early dead were not yet surrounded by the full language of later tomb religion, but they were already treated as beings whose journey mattered. A grave was more than a practical place for a body. It became a threshold between the world of the living and another condition that people could sense but not fully describe. The things placed with the dead suggest that the living imagined some kind of need beyond death, some continuation of identity, some relationship that did not end simply because breath had stopped. As rulers became more powerful, their burials became more important. The death of an ordinary person touched a family. The death of a king touched the order of the land. If the ruler stood between Egypt and the forces of disorder, then his passing could not be treated as a private event. It had to be given form. It had to be managed through ceremony and construction. It had to become part of the same cosmic pattern that allowed the sun to return and the river to rise again. In this way, royal death became one of the great engines of Egyptian civilization. The earliest royal tombs were not pyramids, but they already pointed toward the Pyramid Age. They were built with the idea that death required architecture. The king's body needed a place of protection, but the tomb also needed to speak. It had to show status, command labor, preserve memory, and make visible the belief that the ruler had entered another state of power. Even before the stone monuments, Egypt was learning that a tomb could become a statement about the universe. It could say that order did not break when a king died. It changed form and continued. This is one of the reasons Egypt became so different from many other ancient worlds. Its greatest buildings were not made primarily for the living to gather inside. They were made for the dead to endure. That may sound strange, but for Egypt it was deeply practical in a sacred sense. If the dead remained connected to the living world, then caring for them helped preserve the larger balance. A tomb was not only a monument to loss, it was a house for continued presence. It kept a name near the earth. It held offerings, images, and rituals that allowed the boundary between life and death to remain open in a controlled and meaningful way. For kings, this idea became immense. The ruler's body was no longer simply the body of a man. It had carried divine responsibility in life, and in death, it entered the realm of gods, stars, and ancestors. The tomb gave that transformation a place. It fixed the king into the sacred landscape and allowed later generations to approach him through ritual. The dead king did not vanish from Egypt's order. He became woven into it. So when we look ahead toward the pyramids, we should not imagine them as sudden acts of vanity. They were the result of a long Egyptian habit of taking death seriously as part of life's structure. The people of the Nile had watched return and preservation for generations. They had buried their dead in a landscape that could hold the body with eerie tenderness. They had learned to see the horizon as a place of passage rather than simple ending. By the time kings commanded larger tombs, the deeper idea was already waiting, that the dead could be protected, remembered, transformed, and made lasting through the work of the living. In this older Egypt, the dream of eternity was still gathering its strength. It had not yet reached the clean geometry of the pyramid, but its foundations were already present in the desert sand, in the careful grave, in the ceremony around a ruler's death, and in the belief that order could continue beyond the visible world. Egypt was beginning to build not only for survival or power, but for a future no living person could enter while awake. Section 8. As Egypt learned to build for the dead, it also learned to build with stone. This was not only a change in material, it was a change in ambition. Mud brick could shape houses, walls, storehouses, and early tombs, but mud brick belonged to the cycle of repair. It cracked, softened, weathered, and returned slowly to the earth. Stone felt different. Stone resisted the season. Stone held an edge beneath the sun. Stone gave human intention a weight that ordinary building could not carry. The move toward stone was not sudden, and it did not mean that older materials vanished from Egyptian life. Most people still lived in a world shaped by earth, reeds, wood, plaster, and clay. The living could dwell in what was temporary because life itself was temporary, but the dead, especially the royal dead, asked for something more enduring. The tomb became the place where Egypt tested its deepest desire. If a name could be preserved, if a body could be protected, if a ritual could be repeated, then perhaps a person could continue in some form beyond the reach of ordinary decay. This desire grew stronger as royal power became more organized. A king who could command labor across the land could also command memory on a new scale. The tomb no longer had to be only a hidden place beneath the desert surface. It could rise, it could mark the horizon, it could turn the ruler's death into something visible from far away. In that movement from grave to monument, Egypt began to change the meaning of architecture. A building could become a kind of spell made from labor, geometry, belief, and time. The step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara belongs to this great turning. It did not yet have the smooth sides of the later pyramids, but it carried the idea upward with astonishing force. Earlier tomb forms were transformed into something larger, stacked toward the sky as if the old burial mound had learned to climb. Around it grew a complex of courts, walls, chapels, and ritual spaces made in stone, preserving forms that had once belonged to more fragile materials. The result was not only a tomb, it was a sacred landscape built for the continuing life of the king. Behind this achievement stands the figure of Imhotep, later remembered as a wise man, architect, healer, and almost legendary mind. Whether we can reach the full truth of him or not, his name gives a human shape to the change. Someone had to imagine that stone could do what older materials had only promised. Someone had to understand how form, ritual, engineering, and royal meaning could be brought together. In later memory, Imhotep became more than a builder because the building itself felt like more than construction. It felt like knowledge made permanent. The pyramid form would continue to evolve after Djoser. Builders learned from failure, from experiment, from the stubborn realities of weight and angle. Some pyramids changed shape as they rose. Some did not achieve the perfection their makers wanted, but each attempt belonged to the same unfolding dream. Egypt was learning how to turn death into a structure that touched the sky. The tomb was becoming less like a place of burial and more like a machine of eternity, a sacred form designed to help the king pass beyond the human world and remain bound to the order of the cosmos. This is why the pyramids still feel strange to us. They are simple shapes, but they carry enormous meaning. A pyramid is stone, but it is also horizon, stairway, mountain, sunbeam, and memory. It belongs to the desert, yet it points beyond the desert. It covers the dead, yet it rises for the living to see. It is silent, but it speaks one idea with almost frightening confidence, that human beings once believed permanence could be built if enough faith, labor, and power were gathered into one form. By the time Egypt approached the age of the Great Pyramids, the old Nile world had become something vast. The river still fed the fields as it always had, but now its harvest could support craftsmen, quarry workers, priests, officials, scribes, and the immense coordination required for royal building. The monuments were not separate from the river, they were made possible by it. Every block lifted in the desert carried within it the hidden work of floodwater, grain, storage, and the obedience of a society trained to think of the king's eternity as part of the world's order. In these early stone monuments, we can feel Egypt becoming the Egypt of memory. Not yet the whole story, not yet the long procession of temples and tombs that would follow, but already unmistakable. The river had given life, the desert had preserved death, kingship had gathered order. Now, stone began to hold it all in a form that could outlast the voices of those who built it. Section 9. By the time Egypt began to raise its royal monuments in stone, another quiet power was taking shape beside them. A civilization that builds for eternity must also learn how to remember with precision. Stone can hold a form, but memory needs signs. It needs names that do not vanish when a voice is gone. It needs marks that can carry a command beyond the person who first spoke it. Out of the older world of images and symbols, Egypt began moving toward writing. Writing did not arrive as a simple invention, complete and waiting to be used. It grew from the same symbolic soil that had already shaped early Egyptian imagination. A carved animal, a royal emblem, a sacred sign, or a mark of ownership could begin as image and slowly become language. At first, such signs may have belonged close to power. They could name a ruler, identify a place, mark goods, or bind an object to authority. But once a people learn that a sign can hold meaning beyond the moment, the world changes. A mark can outlive the hand that made it. A name can travel without the body that carried it. For Egypt, the written name became especially powerful. To name something was not merely to label it. A name helped anchor existence. If a king's name could be preserved, then the king was not entirely surrendered to time. If the dead could be named in ritual, then they could continue to receive attention from the living. If a god could be named, approached, and invoked through sacred signs, then writing became more than record-keeping. It became part of the bridge between the visible and invisible worlds. This is why Egyptian writing never feels purely practical. It was used for administration, of course, because any growing kingdom needs to count, store, command, and organize. A state cannot depend only on memory when grain, labor, offerings, land, and royal orders must move across distance. But in Egypt, the practical and the sacred were rarely far apart. The same culture that marked goods for control also carved words to preserve the dead. The same skill that served the palace could serve the tomb. Writing helped manage the kingdom, but it also helped imagine eternity. The scribe became one of the essential figures of Egyptian life. He was not a king, and he was not always a priest, yet he possessed a kind of quiet magic. He could make speech endure. He could turn breath into mark, and mark into memory. In a world where most labor was done by hands in fields, workshops, quarries, and boats, the scribe worked with signs that shaped what others knew, owed, owned, remembered, and believed. His work was calm on the surface, but powerful underneath. A kingdom that could write could reach farther than a kingdom that could only speak. As writing matured, Egypt's monuments gained another layer of life. A tomb without words can still impress the eye, but a tomb with writing can address the unseen. It can speak for the dead. It can preserve titles, prayers, offerings, and hopes. It can turn a wall into a voice. Later, the Egyptians would fill sacred spaces with texts meant to guide, protect, and transform. But even in the earlier stages, the direction was clear. Egypt wanted memory to become durable. It wanted the passing moment to be held. There is something deeply human in this. Beneath all the grandeur, beneath the crowns and divine claims, writing begins with a fear we still recognize. The fear of being forgotten. The fear that a life might pass and leave no shape behind. Egypt answered that fear with unusual confidence. It placed names in stone. It made images repeat. It built tombs where the dead could be approached through ritual and remembrance. It treated memory not as a soft emotion, but as a structure that could be maintained. This gives early Egypt a strange intimacy. The monuments are enormous, but the impulse beneath them is close to us. A person wants their name to remain. A family wants the dead to be cared for. A ruler wants power to survive the body. A civilization wants its order to seem older and stronger than any one generation. Writing allowed Egypt to gather these desires and give them form. It did not replace the river, the desert, or the tomb. It joined them. So as we pass through this chapter, Egypt is no longer only a land of water, fields, graves, and stone. It is becoming a land of signs. The world that once spoke through image now begins to speak through writing. The dream of Egypt deepens because now it can remember itself. It can tell the dead who they were. It can tell the living what they owe. It can tell the future that a name was here and that someone once believed it should last. Section 10. As Egypt learned to preserve names, build tombs, and bind the land beneath kingship, its imagination reached more deeply into the sky. The Egyptians did not look upward, as if the heavens were separate from life below. The sky belonged to the same great order as the river and the fields. The sun's path, the movement of stars, the changing light over the desert, and the quiet return of dawn all seemed to reveal a universe that could be trusted because it moved with pattern. This was not curiosity in the modern sense alone. The sky mattered because it showed rhythm on a scale larger than human life. A person could die, a village could change, a king could pass into the tomb. But the sun still rose over the eastern horizon. The stars still returned to their appointed places. Night still opened above the land with a calm that made the world feel ancient, even to those who lived near its beginning. To watch the sky was to feel that order existed beyond the reach of any single generation. That feeling entered Egyptian religion with extraordinary force. The sun was not merely a bright object crossing the day. It became a sacred journey, a daily victory over darkness, a sign that disappearance could be followed by return. Each evening, the sun seemed to sink beyond the edge of the world, and each morning it emerged again, renewed. For a people already shaped by the returning flood and the preservation of the dead in desert sand, this pattern spoke with deep authority. The universe itself seemed to say that endings were not always final. The horizon became one of Egypt's great imaginative places. It was where the visible world touched what could not be fully seen. The sun appeared there. The sun vanished there. Tombs and monuments placed in the desert could seem to belong to that same threshold, standing between the green life of the river valley and the silent country of the dead. When the Egyptians built for eternity, they were not simply placing stone wherever it was convenient, they were working within a sacred landscape where direction, light, and distance carried meaning. The pyramids draw much of their power from this relationship with the sky. Their shape is so simple that it almost refuses explanation, yet it keeps gathering meaning around itself. It can be seen as a mound rising from the first earth, or as a stairway, or as a frozen ray of sunlight reaching down into stone. However we approach it, the form feels like an answer to the same question that had followed Egypt from its earliest graves. How can the dead pass beyond disappearance? How can a name endure? How can the human world remain connected to the eternal order above it? In later ages, the stars would become part of royal afterlife belief with great intensity. The king was imagined among imperishable lights, joining a realm that did not decay as earthly things decayed. But even before such ideas were written in their fullest form, the attraction of the sky was already present. The heavens offered Egypt an image of permanence that did not need walls or voices. Stars did not rot. Dawn did not forget to come. The sky seemed to hold memory without effort. This is why Egyptian civilization can feel so calm and so intense at the same time. It was surrounded by change, yet it kept seeking what did not change. The Nile rose and fell, but its return gave reassurance. The body died, but preservation suggested continuation. Kings came and went, but kingship claimed to renew order. The sun disappeared, but light returned. Egypt built its deepest meanings out of these repeated encounters with loss and recovery. It trusted pattern because pattern was everywhere. By now, in our journey through this chapter, the older Egypt beneath the famous Egypt has begun to show itself. It is no longer only a prelude. It is the ground from which everything later rose. The pharaoh, the tomb, the written name, the sacred animal, the solar journey, the monument against the desert sky, all of these belong to a dream that had been forming long before the world called Egypt eternal. The dream was not that life would never end. The dream was that life could be gathered into order so carefully that even death would not be allowed to scatter it completely. And so, the Egypt before the pyramids was already looking beyond the human lifespan. Its villages had become memories, its burials had become thresholds, its rulers had become signs of cosmic balance, its writing had begun to hold the name against silence, its sky had become a map of return. What came later would be grander, brighter, and more famous, but not more mysterious. The mystery was already there, flowing quietly beside the Nile, beneath the old stars. Section 11. When we ask whether Egypt was older than we think, the answer is not only a matter of dates, it is also a matter of depth. The Egypt most people remember is the Egypt of finished forms, where the pharaoh stands already sacred, the pyramid already rises from the desert, and the written name already holds its place against time. But beneath that visible Egypt was a longer becoming. The dream did not begin when the monuments became enormous. It began when the Nile Valley first taught human beings to imagine that life could be ordered, remembered, and carried beyond the edge of death. This older Egypt was not hidden because it was unimportant. It was hidden because its traces are quieter. A mud brick wall does not survive like a pyramid. A village hearth does not command the eye like a temple. A burial in dry sand does not announce itself like a royal tomb. Yet, the fragile things often hold the first truth of a civilization. Before a people can build in stone, they must learn what deserves to be made permanent. Before a king can claim eternity, the culture around him must already believe that eternity can be approached. Before writing can preserve a name, people must already fear the silence that waits when names are lost. The later Egyptians inherited more than a river valley. They inherited a way of seeing. They saw return in the flood, renewal in the dawn, preservation in the desert, passage in the boat, power in the animal form, and sacred order in the joining of land beneath a ruler. These meanings were not invented in a palace in a single generation. They accumulated slowly, almost like silt left behind after the waters withdrew. Each season added something. Each burial deepened the bond between the living and the dead. Each repeated image made the invisible world feel a little more familiar. By the time Egypt became great in the eyes of history, its inner world was already ancient. That may be why Egypt still feels so strangely complete when we encounter it. Many civilizations leave us with fragments, but Egypt often seems to stare back with a finished face. Its gods have names, its kings have crowns, its monuments have silhouettes that even children recognize, but that completeness can deceive us. It makes the beginning look simpler than it was. Egypt did not wake one morning as a civilization of pyramids and priests. It thickened across generations. It learned itself slowly. It gathered memory until the memory became strong enough to wear stone. There is something almost comforting in that. Even the civilizations that seem eternal were once uncertain. Even Egypt, with all its golden weight, began in small human acts beside a river. People watched the water. People buried their dead. People told stories about what returned after absence. People gave shape to fear, hope, authority, and grief. The world they built was magnificent, but its foundations were intimate. It began with the same human need that has never really left us, the need to make life mean something before it passes. And perhaps this is why Egypt has never truly vanished from imagination. Empires rose after it, languages changed, temples fell silent, tombs were opened, names were forgotten and then remembered again by strangers thousands of years later. Yet Egypt endured as an idea because it had always been built around endurance. It made memory into a sacred duty. It made death into a journey. It made stone into a promise. It made the horizon feel like a doorway rather than an ending. So, as this chapter nears its close, we can let the question soften. Was Egypt older than we think? Yes, in the sense that its famous age rests upon a deeper and quieter age. The pyramids are not the beginning of the dream. They are the moment the dream became impossible to ignore. The true beginning lies farther back, where the Nile moved through a narrow green world, where villages took root, where the dead were placed carefully in the sand, and where people first began to believe that what disappears might still remain. Tonight, we have walked through that older Egypt slowly, without needing to solve all of its mysteries. Some things should remain dim at the edges. The past is not a machine we can take apart and fully rebuild. It is more like a landscape seen by moonlight. Enough is visible to guide us, and enough is hidden to keep it alive. In that half-light, Egypt becomes not only a place in history, but a long human meditation on memory, order, loss, and return. Section 12. And now, seekers, we come to the end of Chapter 3. Tonight, we followed Egypt back beyond the image most familiar to us, beyond the finished pyramids and the golden names, into the older silence beside the Nile. We found a civilization before it became certain of itself. We found a people learning to stay, to bury with care, to watch the sky, to trust the river, and to imagine that the world was held together by patterns deeper than any single life. The Egypt that later built in stone was already forming in these quiet beginnings, where memory gathered slowly and the dream of eternity first opened its eyes. There is a strange peace in remembering that even the greatest civilizations were once unfinished. Egypt, which now feels ancient beyond measure, began as something fragile. It began with hands working near water, with graves placed in dry sand, with symbols whose full meanings have slipped away from us, and with a river that returned often enough to teach generations that disappearance did not have to mean an end. Long before the Pharaoh stood beneath his crown, the Nile Valley had already become a place where life and death seemed to speak to one another across a narrow green world. Perhaps that is why Egypt still feels so powerful in the dark imagination. It does not only show us grandeur, it shows us the human wish to remain, to leave a name, to protect the dead, to make order out of fear, to turn the passing of days into something that feels held by the stars. The pyramids, when they finally rise in history, are not merely monuments of stone. They are the visible crest of a much deeper current, a current that began in village memory, river rhythm, desert preservation, and the ancient hope that the soul might travel farther than the body. As this chapter closes, let Egypt drift away from its sharp outlines. Let the pyramids soften into the distance. Let the Nile darken beneath the evening sky. Let the old villages grow quiet along the banks, their fires low, their paths silvered by moonlight, their dead resting beneath the patient sand. The story does not end here. The Book of Ancient Worlds will open again, and when it does, we will travel eastward into another first civilization, toward the clay tablets, temple towers, kings, gods, and flood-haunted memories of Mesopotamia. But for now, there is no need to follow the road any farther. Remain here a little while beside the river. Let the night settle over the water. Let the desert hold its silence. Let the stars above Egypt become soft and distant, as if they have been watching for longer than thought can measure. Whatever remained unfinished today can wait until morning. Whatever has been heavy in the mind may loosen now, not forever, not because the world has changed, but because just for tonight, the darkness is allowed to carry it for you. In a moment, the voice will fade, and soft music will continue at the end of this chapter. Let it play gently in the room. Let it become part of the quiet. Let your breathing slow with it until the old river is only a dream moving somewhere far below sleep. Rest well, seekers, and until the archive opens again, let the darkness take you kindly, just for tonight.